Before I hand you over to yourselves to ask the panel, I give brief feedback of my own before I forget it, because I actually meant to say it at the end of Brian's presentation, but I forgot. The trip to tiredness. So my reflection thus far today is, besides being very tired, that there was mention of love throughout the day by several of the presenters, and that's a very positive thing, and I think it's certainly something that we need to be more accepting of. But there was also then a mention from several of the presenters, Brian and Jim, and I think Tom touched on it too, that how we treat our staff is very, very important in all this, because they are the same, they're people too. So we all talk about children and how we care for the children, and we see the children and every communication, every behaviour is a communication need. So all our talk is about children. And here today there's a lot of talk about how language has changed over the years. We don't talk about the disturbed child, we changed to a more acceptable language and how we reference children. For myself, following Brian's and Clive's presentations, there's one axiom that I know that exists in childcare and still in time within childcare. And that axiom is simply that as we treat the staff, there's a direct correlation to how they can or will treat the children. And you can call that holding, call whatever way you want. But ultimately, that's a fact. So, if we're talking about love, and for that being okay in how we engage with the children, there has to be a connection there in how we reference and regard and talk about our staff. But I wonder, has the language shifted in relation to how we reference staff as much as it has shifted in how we reference the children? So those are my rambling thoughts that I leave you all with, and I now would like the floor to ask questions of the presenters. And I see if you need a mic, if you have mics, maybe you'll follow.
I want to answer your question first. This is a question. Has the language shifted in how we talk about staff? And I would say to some extent it is, but to a great extent it's not. Because we have a way of thinking of staff as being somehow superior to children because they're adults and therefore should be able to behave in a certain way. And so I think there's a tendency on our part still to say, he's an adult, he should know better. And in a way, that's just how we used to talk about kids, isn't it, right? She's 16, she should know better. So we're still using that kind of language, I think, often in our relationships with staff, just because we think of them as adults.
I've got quite clear views on this, actually, that in the UK in particular, there is so much pressure on so many people in social care that people are being asked to do more and more with less resources, with less support, and increasingly are told that they're failing, and there are punitive measures brought on to people in social care because the state and the people who are senior managers don't understand what's important to the people who are doing the work and how they wish to be supported or how they should be supported. So, in order for us to understand how we provide care for the people that ultimately we are there for, then we need to understand what the role and the purpose is of the people who are providing that support, and not what the outcomes are for the state and what the outcomes are for your managers and people in leadership positions. So I'll get some people in leadership positions to start thinking about what it is that you need to do to support the people in order for them to support the people who use your services to get quality outcomes.
Can I just comment on something that James said before that was just struck with me?
Can I come here?
I just want to comment on something that James said this morning that stuck with me about children not knowing why they're in care. And that's something that I've struggled with as a carer for a long time. But at one point I'd had the fortunate experience of being able to work in one place for 9 years with the same kids. And one thing I found with them was that story had to be told to them many times. And each time I told it to them, it was as if they were hearing it for the first time. And they would look at it from a different way and they'd ask different questions about it. But it wasn't just, just telling them once and then leaving it at that. And I think, and it's only my own thought, that part of that is that the experience is so traumatic of coming into care that they can't digest it or understand it straight away. That they need the time and they need the consistency of people to be there. And I think that's missing at your residential care at the minute, that there is no consistency. And it's very hard to.
I really appreciate what you just said, because when you first come into care, you're not going to hear very much of anything. It's going to go right through because you're focused on survival, you're focused on reading other behaviors, and the words are just going to get lost here very, very right. But we do have to find those moments when we can communicate to the level the child's ready to hear. Thank you.
I think maybe another thing that happens is when children first come into care, they hear you through the context of their experience. And as they've been with you longer, the context of their experience changes. So therefore, I can now hear this differently. So when I first come into care, the context of my experience is, abuse, mistrust, whatever it happens to be. And as we work together relationally and we develop relational safety, I begin to hear things differently, or I'm able to allow myself to hear things differently. So I think it's a really good point. And it is true that, kids goes in one ear and out the other. And it's also true, I think, that they hear differently depending on their experience.
I find very often that the best time to communicate something like that is in a very informal setting. And I was just thinking there of my own 16-year-old son. And some of the most meaningful conversations that I have with him nowadays are in the car and we're sitting side by side. And he'll suddenly break into something quite serious, something that he hasn't mentioned before. And we'll have quite a serious conversation while I'm driving. And sort it all out, all dealt with in a couple of minutes, and then ne'er to be mentioned again. So I think there are opportunities there with young people that we're working with as well, that the informal setting like that, often side by side, can be very powerful, even to communicate things that are fairly profound.
Just one more comment on that. I remember having a conversation with Michael Little, who was at the Dartington Social Research Unit. He's done a lot of research on residential care with Roy Parker and Bullock and people like that. And he asked me, he said, well, when we did a survey of hundreds of workers in UK, and the activity they do the most, workers? What's the one thing they do more than anything else? I made a couple of guesses in the throng. He said, driving kids. Now you see, if you were a manager with a certain logic model, you'd say that's a waste of public money to have childcare workers driving kids. But we all know that that is when conversations happen that will not happen anywhere else. There is something about that side-by-side relationship rather than face-to-face. Also, we're often driving them to places like doctor's appointments or to psychologists or something. That's a time where stuff comes up, right? Picking them up afterwards and just being sensitive to whatever experience they've been going through, or picking them up from parents or whatever. So yeah, that just shows how the logic models have to be congruent right up the line, because that would be interpreted as, oh, we just hired cheaper drivers. Why should we send childcare workers to drive kids?
This is just actually a comment for the panel, and just to maybe request that you would have a little think about what I'm going to say just now. Firstly, I'd like to thank all the speakers today. It's been very enlightening for me. I'm a humanitarian worker. I work in County Waterford with refugees and asylum seekers. Most of the speakers today have been talking about children in care. We are working with unaccompanied minors in this country who are technically not in care. They are living in deprivation systems, and when we're talking about children, when you're talking about a level of complex vulnerability, where do we stop calling a young person a child, and when do we expect them to behave and understand and believe like an adult? So I suppose my comment is we're actually speaking tomorrow ourselves on our own situation, but could speakers and attendants kind of think about what about the young people that are technically in care, not in care? They are stateless persons because they don't have refugee status in this country yet. And the big question for us is who is responsible? So that's a theme that has been recurring throughout the day today. And I would like people to have a think about what about the kids and the vulnerable young people out there that don't necessarily fit into the model.
We were wondering if that's a question. I think there's something for us to think about, and I am thinking about it. I mean, I have had some contact with people who work with what we used to call Vietnamese boat children and groups like that, and it is a different ballgame. But I think a lot of the interactional dynamics would be very similar. But you're right; they come from a different place and they need a different kind of response, probably. But I think you've asked us to reflect on that, and here we got to say tomorrow. Sorry.
No.
I was going to ask the audience, is there anything you want to comment on? So anything, I'm always interested in what you heard, what you're taking away, so that it helps us to kind of understand what's connecting and what isn't.
For me, one of the biggest things that struck me from all of the talks today, particularly Tom, workshop earlier, actually goes back to a workshop I did earlier on in the year about child exploitation, child sexual exploitation, and we were looking at the behaviours of the groomers and why the groomers are being so much more successful than we are as social care staff. And they are actually using our models, only they're applying them so much more successfully because they don't have that boundary in place, or perhaps they're leading young people, they are leading young people to believe that they do love them and they care for them and they're giving them that peace that is missing for us as social care workers. So for me, that's such a huge thing that kind of just struck me today, that it seems simple, but it's like it's far more complicated than rocket science, and yet some of the things that we're fighting against, it's just they're doing it so much better, and we need to competing with that, and just what holds the kids together in the streets, and what we need to do as social care workers and social workers and youth care workers and social workers to actually hold the kids with us rather than realize that kind of struggle.
I had a young person who just had left care and said she wanted to come and talk to our students about the experience, and very powerful. But we all were struck dumb when she said, I haven't had a hug in 5 years. This is an 18, 19-year-old. I haven't had a hug in 5 years. You've got to think about that. There are even rules about hugging kids and not hugging kids in our school system in America. Now, we all understand where that comes from, but it's not okay that we just don't hug kids.
I agree entirely. I think the Dalai Lama tells us we need 7 hugs a day. Can I just go back to your point about the children with no status? From my perspective, whether you're a child, you're a person, or a vulnerable adult, you're a person. The most important thing that we need to do is to identify what's important to you and how to support you. And I think the conversations that we need to have are about bringing all of those people. Is about how do we understand who you are? What is it that we need to do to ensure that you get support the way that you want the support to be provided in the place that you need to be provided? I don't think age matters. If somebody's vulnerable, they're vulnerable, and we need to plan with them so that we can be successful in helping them to get out of that vulnerable situation or to be less vulnerable. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a question, Tom?
Oh, sorry. I'm thinking about the comment about groomers, you know, and how really quite brilliant they can be, right? And as I was just sitting here thinking about what you said, going through all those characteristics I was talking about today about how we develop safe places or places kids experience as safe in relationship. And I was thinking, you're absolutely right. We have to stop talking about this. We may be educating the wrong people. You know? Because if you watch someone who is very good at seducing children, right? They are attending to needs, right? They're creating experiences of safety. They're creating experiences of respect often, you know, and blah, blah, blah. I can go through the whole list. Because that's how they manage to seduce children to a place where they can abuse them or harm them or whatever happens. Anyways, thanks for the comment. Something I'd like to think about.
Can I ask a question about the panel, Tom? If we recognise that we can influence young people, can I ask for one piece of advice from each of the panel members about what they would give as the most potent and powerful piece of advice to a young child and youth care worker just coming into the field?
My first one is learn as fast as you can, and it's not about you.
Quickly before it's taken by somebody else. But quite, be sincere and be fair.
For me, it's to enable the person to see who that child is, and so for that child to believe that they are the most important person to you whilst you are with them, and I mean with them and alongside them. And so we're not fixing people, we're living alongside them and supporting them.
I would say, if you're motivated by genuine caring, then it's okay if you screw up. That children will forgive you if they sense the motivation to genuine caring. I just can't imagine even trying to count the number of times that kids have forgiven me for something that, you know, I did wrong or whatever. And when I think of the times that they did, I was probably maybe motivated more by my own needs than anything else. Right?
Time maybe for one last question. It's 11 o'clock. Anybody have a variety of questions?
Just a comment.
One of the things that I kind of picked up today from most of the speakers, and I think it's an important thing, because I know our service on Tuesday is restructuring and there's lots of changes. And what concerns me moving forward for ourselves across all the spectrum is that we can create systems and we can place people in boxes, but if our service doesn't keep the children and the families in the centre, we're going to miss something. We're going to find ourselves repeating patterns from before. One of the things that really struck me with Jim's input this morning was the whole thing about congruence. And I had the privilege of being at the Foster Carers Association conference a couple of weekends in Donegal, and I heard this foster mother who had just been given an infant for the first time, and the child was very traumatised pregnancy, never mind the birth. And she went home for the first 3 weeks, and she sat in bed with that child and had the child skin to skin against her. So the child would develop smell, she could feed, and she said her husband was a saint because he got with her and basically went back. And she spoke about exactly what you were saying, Jim, just earlier. We know when it's appropriate to hold and give affection to those who we care for and those who we work with. And what worries me moving forward is, I have many therapeutic sessions with kids that I work with, and if they're distressed and upset, the most natural thing is to give a pat on the shoulder or move your hand towards theirs and hold their hand. But you know that's appropriate, and you know that that's right in your skin. And I think we need to hold on to those ethics, because that's what we get from our own families when we're growing up. Why should those children be deprived of those experiences? Have they not already had enough deprivation in their life? And I think that's where we as professionals need to be able to stand up and say, actually, and it's like what Clive said earlier about loans, actually, that is right, it is appropriate. And we need to hold on to those and not work out a fear-based reaction. We think of, oh, what will the system say? In that given moment, you know what's the right connection there. You know what's appropriate. And not to risk not doing that. Because that could be the very point that softens something that can be so stuck in a young person and free them to find the next step forward. I think that's really, and it saddens me to hear that a young person would say it's 5 years since I got a book. And I thought, wasn't it wonderful to hear a foster mother take the risk, get into bed for 3 weeks and lie the child naked against her body to make that connection and attachment, and stood there really strong in front of her fellow foster carers and people crying in the room when they heard it, because she really believes for that child and that attachment that that's going to help that child. And I thought it was wonderful to come back to the basics. I mean, it's not rocket science. Yes, it is complex. But that whole compassion, love, and making the connections also is more than just the emotional connections. It's actually, you're upset, I give you a little pat on the shoulder, or I rub you, or I give you a little gesture, or I think we need to hold on to that as professionals and not lose that. I'm 25 years as a practitioner, and the one thing that worries me is we're becoming more boxed and in boxes, and the system is becoming the centre rather than the children and their needs being in the centre. And the one thing that refreshed me today was to hear about how each different speaker has done it and spoke how they were trying to keep the welfare of those in the centre that they were working and their needs. And I think if we stick within that, we do a reasonably good enough job for those children to start with.
I know you just made a comment there. I mentioned the care experience during people from True Care Scotland at the International Social Work Federation, who were all very clear that the one thing that the majority of them didn't get and weren't told that they all wanted when they were in care was somebody to say that they loved them or that they were loved. I thought that was the most powerful thing that came out of that conference, was that people who had experienced being sent to prison, being sent to young offenders units, who have that really challenging childhoods with drugs and murder, that nobody in their care experience ever told them that they were loved.
Okay, well, I think we've gone slightly over time. So, okay, I'll wrap up. Thank you all very much for attending and participating. Thank you to the panel members who gave brilliant presentations. Thank you to all the workshop presenters who gave equally brilliant workshops. I can see them and those are good. So, it's been a great day. I have enjoyed it. Hopefully I'm tired. And I hope that everybody that's been here today takes something out of it, takes a relationship, even one relationship, and builds on that. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you tomorrow.